And so often we use snaps in theater to quick rig a costume. We replace the buttons with snaps to allow them to be taken off easily, to snap open. But they come in a lot of different sizes. So this is just an example of some of the sizes available. This size here is the largest, and that's a Whopper Popper. Legitimately its name. It's just a really large size. The Junior Whopper Popper is here next. The bigger the snap, the more fortitude they have while snapping. And so those are for garments that really need a lot of strength to hold the weight together. This is a size 4 and very common for waistbands of skirts if we're quick rigging those. And this is a size 2. It's a nice size for quick rigging out dress shirts and things like that. Now snaps have 2 sides to every snap. You have the positive side that has a thinner base and a piece that comes out, and the negative side, which has a thicker base and a receptacle so that those can snap together, just like that. So for every snap, you have to make sure to put this positive side facing up and this negative side facing up. Otherwise, they're not going to snap together properly. As we're pretending that this is a small little shirt, where eventually we would have buttonholes on this side to have our buttons go through, this is the outside of the garment, and this is the underside of the lap, with this being the inside of the garment. And why I'm going over that again is that it makes a difference on how we place our snaps. So as we saw earlier with the snap intro, is that we do have our 2 sides, our positive side that comes out and our negative side that recedes in so that they can snap together. It's not just a clever name. But the difference in height also makes a difference on how they get placed onto the garment. So our negative side has a lot more depth to it. This will actually go onto the underside of the placket. So then that way we're snapping into something and we don't have the bulk of this pushing through the outside of the fabric. So I'll fold that back for now and kind of get it out of the way. So eventually we will place the negative or wider side on the underlap and the positive or kind of more narrow piece on the overlap. But we're not going to center those on our button placket like we did with our buttons, because then when we go to snap these together, we're going to have too much fabric off to the side of it, and it'll make for a weird flap. So unlike the buttons that get centered on our plackets, we have to place our snaps and our hook and bar to be closer to the edge of our placket, so then that way they're not leaving a weird flap. So we're going to transfer some markings. So holding your fabric nice and flat, making sure that you're not stretching this top layer, I'm going to put my fingers on there just to hold my layers in place, and I'm going to peel back so that I can transfer my X's from my underlap to my overlap. So I'm just giving myself a little line. I'm not using the full plus because this is just placing it on our placket. It's not going to be centered right there. So you see how I have the 2 marks that have been transferred from my underlap to my overlap. Because when we're done, we want to make sure that our closures will line up and close in a way that won't make the placket buckle or do weird things like that. So now that I have my markings on the underside of my overlap, this is the right side of my shirt. The goal for these snaps is to place them about a 1/4 inch away from the edge. So using a pin, I can pin down straight through my snaps and keeping it in line with the marking so that I know that this snap will line up from where that snap goes. I'll pin down through my fabric, making sure that this edge is not more or less than a 1/4 inch away. And the reason why we say a 1/4 is that that's enough to hide the snap, but not so much that it'll create a weird flap once the snap is in place. When we're working on our snaps, because this side is going to be to the right side, the outside, any work we do through the snap will have to be nice and clean and neat. So on this side, when we stitch through each of these holes, you will do a total of 5 different stitches in the hole. The first 4 just through this internal layer, with the 5th being a pick stitch that goes through to the outside. So when we're done our snap, we will just have 4 little visible pick stitches, 1 for each of these holes in the snap. But because we're going to start first, we'll do a small pick stitch just to kind of hide our knot under our snap, and we'll pull that tight. We won't worry about doing a double locking stitch because there's so many stitches that will hold this in place. So I'll just spin my snap until one of these holes lines up with my thread. And while we have this pin in place, just be mindful that you don't loop around that edge. So now here's the tricksy bit where you want to stitch around the snap. So I'm going to go down on the outside of the metal and come up through the hole, but I'm just angling my needle. I'm not stitching all the way through, and I'm not going through to the outside. And so I'll do 4 stitches like this. And so I'm taking a small pick stitch, going down next to the metal hole and coming up through it. And I'm fanning my stitches. And so what that means is that I'm not layering them on top of each other like we did with the button. I'm trying to fan them out so that they lay side by side along this hole, and that just makes for a more secure snap. So now that I've done 4, I'll do a pick stitch to the outside. So you'll see I'm finally bringing my needle all the way through. And then I'll pull that tight, and then taking a small stitch right next to where I came out, I'll angle my needle to come back through the hole of that snap. And the reason why we do this pick stitch is that if we only sewed through the internal layers, see how I can pull these layers apart? When you're snapping, you don't want the button placket to be poofy like that. So we use these pick stitches as a way to hold our layers together, but to not be too obvious about it. And now we'll travel on to the next hole. So I've left my pin in there because until I have 2 holes stitched, this snap could swing out of place. But I'm not going to travel straight over to that hole, because if I do, then this thread will be exposed on top. So I'll do 1 more pick stitch right next to my work. And then because I've sunk that underneath the snap, when I come up through the next hole, you see how that thread goes away? So the thread is now hiding between those layers. And then I'll make 1 stitch through the interior layer. I won't go through to the outside. And I'll just start that second hole. Now that I have this one started, I can remove the pin because my snap isn't going to pivot anywhere. And then we'll just keep doing the same technique. So I'll do 4 stitches just through the inside layer. Still not going through to the outside. And then a 5th stitch is a pick. And so I'm coming out of the fabric and I'll go in right next to it. If you're too far away when you go back into the fabric, then it'll make too visible of a stitch. And then a 6th stitch just to anchor. And then I'll come up through the next hole. And that traveling stitch travels between the snap and the fabric. So in this case, my thread just broke. So what I'll do is I'll pull it down so that it becomes double again. And I'm just going to add a few extra stitches on top. So you don't have to do this in case, but you can if your thread breaks. So I'm just going to tie this off. So in that way that thread doesn't go anywhere. And if I wanted to be super secure, I could take this piece and thread it and put it down through the fabric. Or I can just trim it and layer a few more stitches on top of my work. And then to finish, I'll do a double locking stitch. And then because I have multiple layers, I will go ahead and hide my thread between the layers, so going down next to my knot and only going through that internal layer, and then trimming my thread. So now we're ready to set the other side of our snap. So we have a little bit of information where we know that it's going to eventually live right on that same plane where the plus sign is, and it'll live a little ways on this side. And so one way is to go ahead and snap it and see if it sits. And then you can either mark that or pin that, but I'll show you another way as well. So I'm going to flip this to the inside, and right now I have access to that little positive snap. But if I lay my fabric over, so then that way my folded edge here is covering that stitch line, which is how they were built. I'm just going to feel through and feel for that little bump of the positive snap. And then finding the center of it, I'll put my pin through the fabric. So if you guys lift up, you can see that I'm going right through into that snap. But when I pull my fabric off, this pin stays in place for me. And that way, I can put this snap on it, and it's ready in place. That way when I close this, it'll line up well and good. Because this snap is being sewn to the inside or to the underside of the placket, and that this is the inside of the garment, we don't have to hide our stitches like we did on this side. So I'm going to come in up from the underside of the snap, and I'll hide my knot on the wrong side, much like I did with my buttons. And I'm coming straight up through one of these holes. And so the technique is the same. I will come up through a hole and I'll go down through a hole. So right now I'm just holding it so that my fingers are kind of nestled on that pin, but find a way that's comfortable and that doesn't move the snap around on you. So I'll stitch down right next to my snap and going through all layers. And as I draw my thread down, I'm just being mindful that it's not grabbing around that pin. And either you can flip your fabric and you can use your original knot as your example or as your stay point. But similar to the top side of the snap, I'm just going to fan my stitches. So they're going to be about 1/8 of an inch in width. And I'm going to take small stitches and go around that hole. And similar to the other side, you'll do 5 stitches or so. And then when we're ready to travel from one side to the other, you'll use the same technique of a small anchor stitch to travel underneath the snap, between the snap and the fabric. We don't travel on the underside because then we'll have exposed threads on the wrong side, and that can just be ugly. So I'll take that small pick stitch to anchor my work, and I'll pull it tight so that I can come up through this hole, and I'll just set this next hole so that I can take this pin out. And just like the top side, once you get one hole done, you just repeat the technique as you work your way around. And then once you're done your last hole, you'll bring your thread through to the wrong side and you'll finish with a double locking stitch. So taking your pick stitch, wrapping your thread twice or going through the loop, pulling it down, and then traveling 1/4 inch away through all layers to trap your thread tail. And that way, when you go to put your snaps together, they'll snap, they'll close, the fabric won't ruffle down the way, and your folded edge is placed to make sure that you've hidden that stitching of the underlap.